Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little ambitious, a story about how a city that started as a muddy cluster of huts somehow decided, very casually, to dominate most of the known world. So dim the lights a bit, get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket over yourself. There's no rush here. We're just going to drift through time, slowly watching a group of stubborn, overly competitive people accidentally build an unstoppable empire, mostly because they refused to lose. And honestly, they really hated losing. Now, before Rome was the Roman Empire, before the emperors, the marble statues, and the dramatic speeches, it was just a republic. Which sounds respectable, almost modern, like they had things figured out. They did not. The Roman Republic was chaotic,
Loud.
argumentative, a place where politicians yelled at each other in public forums and then sometimes went off to command armies. Because why not mix politics and military power? What could possibly go wrong? But here's the thing. That chaos weirdly worked. Rome had this deeply ingrained belief that failure was not an option. Not in a motivational poster kind of way, but in a stubborn, slightly terrifying, we will just keep throwing resources at this until it works kind of way. Let's float back to one of their earliest habits, losing battles and then pretending that didn't matter. When Rome fought wars, especially in the early days, they didn't always win. In fact, they lost quite a few times. But unlike most ancient states, which would lose a battle and then politely give up or negotiate, Rome would lose, pause for a moment, and then come back with a bigger army. And then another one. And then another one. It's like they treated defeat as a mild inconvenience. Like spilling a drink. Annoying, but not something that stops your evening. This habit becomes very clear during their long, exhausting conflicts with their neighbors in Italy. These weren't glamorous wars. No grand speeches. No epic heroes riding into sunset glory. Just years of grinding, repetitive fighting. Rome would fight, lose some men, recruit more, fight again. It's not exciting. It's not dramatic. It's just persistent. And that persistence becomes their secret weapon. Now, while they're doing this, they're also quietly building something else. A system. Not a perfect system, but a flexible one. Rome didn't just conquer people and call it a day. That would be too simple. Instead, they had this unusual habit of incorporating the people they defeated. Not everyone, of course. They weren't that generous. But they would often grant partial rights, alliances, or pathways to citizenship. Which sounds surprisingly progressive until you realize it was mostly a strategic move. Because if you make former enemies feel somewhat included, they're less likely to rebel and more likely to fight for you in your next war. It's a bit like saying, "Welcome to the team, now please help us conquer your neighbors." And oddly enough, it worked. So Rome's armies weren't just Romans. They were a growing mix of allied peoples, all contributing manpower, all slowly becoming tied into Rome's expanding influence. Which means every victory didn't just make Rome bigger, it made Rome stronger for the next fight. A kind of snowball effect, but with swords. Now let's drift gently toward one of the first big tests of this system, the moment Rome realized it might actually be a bit unstoppable. Enter the Samnite Wars. Now, the Samnites were not pushovers. They were tough, mountain-dwelling fighters, the kind of people who didn't make things easy. And for a while, Rome struggled. There's even a moment where a Roman army gets trapped in a narrow mountain pass, completely surrounded. It's not a heroic scene. It's more awkward. The Romans are forced to surrender. and not in a dignified way. They have to walk under a symbolic yoke, basically a humiliating structure made of spears, as a sign of defeat. It's the ancient equivalent of being publicly embarrassed in front of everyone you know. And you might think, okay, that's it. That kind of humiliation would crush morale. Maybe Rome takes a break, reconsiders its life choices. No, of course not. Instead, Rome reacts the only way it knows how, by doubling down. They rebuild their forces. They reorganize their army structure. They adapt. And this is another key piece of the puzzle. Rome was weirdly good at learning from its mistakes. Not immediately, not gracefully, but eventually. They started shifting from rigid battle formations to more flexible units, allowing them to fight better in rough terrain. Because apparently, getting trapped in a mountain pass once was enough to convince them, maybe we should rethink things. So they come back. Again. And again. And again. Until eventually the Samnites are worn down. Not necessarily outmatched in skill, but outlasted. And that's kind of Rome's whole vibe at this point. They don't need to be the smartest or the strongest. They just need to keep going longer than you. Now, as Rome tightens its grip on Italy, something subtle but important is happening. They're getting confident. Not in a loud, boastful way, not yet. More like a quiet, creeping sense of, we can probably handle this. Which, historically speaking, is often the beginning of a much bigger story. Because once you think you can handle things, you start taking on bigger challenges. And that brings us slowly to a conflict that changes everything. The moment Rome steps onto a much larger stage. The moment they look across the sea and decide, yes, we should probably get involved in that. Because of course they should. Let's ease into the First Punic War. Now, across the Mediterranean, there's another power. Wealthy. Established. Very comfortable where it is. Carthage. A trading empire. A naval powerhouse. The kind of civilization that doesn't expect to be challenged by a land-based republic that's still figuring things out. Rome, at this point, has a problem. They're very good on land, but the Mediterranean is not land. It's water. A lot of it. And Carthage owns it. So when conflict starts brewing over Sicily, a strategically important island, Rome faces a slightly awkward realization. They need a navy. They do not have a navy. This is inconvenient. But instead of backing away or negotiating or admitting they might be out of their depth, Rome decides to build a navy from scratch. Because apparently that's something you can just do. And here's where things get a little almost absurd. Rome didn't have centuries of naval tradition. They weren't experienced sailors. They weren't known for maritime expertise. So what do? They copy. They literally take a captured Carthaginian ship and use it as a blueprint. It's like reverse engineering your rival's product, except instead of a gadget, it's an entire fleet. And then, because just building ships isn't enough, they add a twist. A boarding device. A kind of rotating bridge called a corvus, which essentially turns naval battles into land battles. Because if there's one thing Rome trusts, it's fighting on solid ground. Even if that ground is temporarily attached to another ship. It's a little clumsy, a little improvised, but it works. Roman ships close in, drop the bridge, and suddenly it's infantry combat on the deck. And Rome is very comfortable with infantry combat. So slowly, awkwardly, they start winning. Not because they're better sailors, but because they've turned the fight into something they understand. And again, we see that pattern. Adaptation, persistence, refusal to quit. The war drags on for years, decades even. Both sides suffer losses. Ships sink. Armies struggle. At one point, Rome loses an entire fleet to a storm, which is not ideal. Most civilizations might take that as a sign. Maybe the sea is not for us. Maybe we should rethink this. Rome's response? Build another fleet. Of course they do. And eventually, Carthage begins to wear down. Not completely defeated in spirit, but stretched thin, tired. And Rome just keeps going until finally they win. And with that victory, something shifts. Rome is no longer just a regional power. They've stepped beyond Italy, beyond their comfort zone. They've taken on a major rival and come out on top. And you can almost feel it, that quiet confidence turning into something more solid, more certain, more dangerous. Because now, Rome knows something. If they can beat Carthage, even on the sea, even when they had no experience, what can't they do? And that question, that slightly unsettling realization, is what starts to make Rome feel unstoppable. But of course, that feeling doesn't lead to calm, peaceful expansion. It leads to more conflict, more ambition, and naturally even bigger mistakes. So as we settle a little deeper into the story, and the night gets quieter, we'll let Rome rest for a moment, sitting there, victorious, slightly overconfident, getting ready without fully realizing it for the next round. Because the next war is not going to be as forgiving. And this time the opponent is going to take things very personally. All right, let's ease back in. Maybe shift a little under the blanket, get comfortable again. Because Rome, after winning the First Punic War, is feeling pretty good about itself. Not loud about it, not bragging, just quietly convinced that things tend to work out in their favor, which historically is usually when things get complicated. Now, across the Mediterranean in Carthage, they are not feeling relaxed, not even slightly. They've just lost a long, exhausting war. They've lost territory, prestige, and most importantly, their sense of being untouchable. And while Rome is over there building confidence, Carthage is dealing with something much more dangerous, resentment. And eventually that resentment finds a face, a very focused, very determined face. Let's drift over to a young man named Hannibal Barca. Now, Hannibal is not your average historical figure. He's not casually involved in politics. He's not trying to maintain balance or stability. He grows up in a household where Rome is basically the villain of every story. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had fought against Rome in the previous war. And before Hannibal even fully understands the world, he's brought to an altar and made to swear an oath. An oath to never be a friend of Rome, which is a strong way to start childhood. Most kids get toys. Hannibal gets a lifelong grudge. And, unsurprisingly, he takes it very seriously. So as he grows older and gains power and eventually takes command of Carthaginian forces, he's not just thinking about strategy. He's thinking about revenge. Calmly, quietly, very intentionally. Now, if you're Carthage and you want to challenge Rome again, you might consider a straightforward approach. Maybe rebuild your navy. Maybe defend your territories. Hannibal does not do that. Of course he doesn't. Instead, he looks at a map, pauses, and decides to do something that feels unnecessarily dramatic. He's going to attack Rome, but not from the sea, not from the south. He's going to go the long way around, through Spain, through Gaul, and then over the Alps. Yes, the Alps. Those large, cold, inconvenient mountains that most people look at and think, maybe not. Hannibal looks at them and thinks, this will be memorable. So he gathers an army, infantry, cavalry, and elephants, because if you're going to cross a mountain range, you might as well bring elephants for atmosphere. Now, this journey is not smooth. It's not heroic in a shiny, cinematic way. It's slow, difficult, cold. Men slip on icy paths. Supplies run low. Local tribes are less than welcoming. And the elephants, while iconic, are not exactly built for mountain hiking. A lot of them don't make it. A lot of people don't make it. But Hannibal keeps going. Because of course he does. And eventually, after all that effort, all that loss, all that determination, he arrives in Italy, right where Rome did not expect him. And suddenly that quiet Roman confidence starts to feel a little less comfortable. Now, what follows is a series of moments where Rome learns that being persistent is great, but it doesn't make you invincible. Let's gently drift into one of those moments. The Battle of Cannae. Now, Rome, being Rome, responds to Hannibal the usual way. They gather a massive army, because when in doubt, just make it bigger. And they face Hannibal in open battle. What could go wrong? Well, quite a bit, actually. Hannibal, calm as ever, sets up his forces in a way that feels slightly unusual. He places his weaker troops in the center and his stronger ones on the sides, which seems counterintuitive, almost like he's inviting the Romans to push forward. And Rome, confident, determined, maybe a little predictable, does exactly that. They push into the center. Hard. The Carthaginian center slowly gives way, bending inward, like a shallow bowl, and the Romans keep advancing deeper and deeper, not realizing they are very gently being surrounded. Then the sides close in, and suddenly the Roman army is trapped, pressed in from all directions. No room to move. No clear escape. It's not chaotic, not loud in our telling, just a slow realization. This is not going well. By the end, it's one of the worst defeats in Roman history. A massive loss of life. An entire army effectively gone. And for a moment, just a moment, it looks like Rome might finally break. Because this isn't a small setback. This is catastrophic. The kind of defeat that ends wars, ends nations, ends stories. So what does Rome do? Well, they take a breath. And then they refuse to panic, which is honestly a little unsettling. Instead of rushing into another battle, instead of reacting emotionally, they change tactics. They avoid direct confrontation. They start wearing Hannibal down slowly, cutting off supplies, harassing smaller units, letting time do the work. It's not glamorous. It's not satisfying. It's patient and a little stubborn, which by now should feel familiar. Hannibal, for all his brilliance, finds himself in a difficult position. He can win battles, but he can't quite finish the war. Rome refuses to collapse, refuses to surrender, refuses to do the thing most enemies eventually do. And over time, that refusal becomes decisive. Because while Hannibal is in Italy far from home, relying on limited support, Rome is still Rome, still producing armies, still gathering resources, still enduring. Eventually the focus shifts. Rome takes the fight elsewhere, back toward Carthage itself. And Hannibal, after years in Italy, is called home, which feels a bit like the story quietly turning. Not with a dramatic twist, just a gentle shift in direction. And when the final confrontation comes at the Battle of Zama, it's different. Rome has learned, adapted. They face Hannibal not as the same republic that panicked at Cannae, but as something more experienced, more cautious, more prepared. And this time, they win. Not easily, not effortlessly, but decisively. Carthage is defeated. Again. And this time, the consequences are heavier. Stricter terms, less freedom, more control. Rome doesn't just win. They make sure the situation won't repeat itself. At least that's the idea. Now, as we slowly drift forward into the quiet aftermath, Rome stands more powerful than ever. They've faced a genius, taken devastating losses, and still come out on top, which reinforces something deep in their identity. This quiet belief that no matter how bad things get, they will find a way through. And that belief is starting to harden into something more permanent, something that doesn't just respond to challenges, but begins to seek them out. So, as the Mediterranean grows a little quieter, and Rome catches its breath, we can feel it again, that gentle shift from survival to dominance, and from dominance to something that looks a lot like inevitability. But, as always, that kind of confidence comes with a cost, and Rome is about to discover that winning outside your borders is sometimes easier than holding things together at home. So let's slowly move in that direction next, toward a different kind of problem, less about enemies across the sea, and more about tension right at the center, because even unstoppable things can start to crack from within. And Rome, with all its political tension, is about to feel the effects of that. Let's float gently toward one of those generals, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Now, Sulla is calm, calculated, not particularly interested in pretending everything is fine. He finds himself in a power struggle, political opponents, rival ambitions, the usual Roman situation. But instead of navigating it through debate or compromise, he does something new, something Rome hasn't quite seen before. He marches his army on Rome itself, which is generally not how republics are supposed to function. Armies are for external threats, not for settling political disagreements. But Sulla does it anyway, because apparently that's where things are now. He takes control, declares himself dictator, and begins a series of very methodical purges. Enemies are listed, targeted, removed. Not chaotic, not emotional, just organized, which somehow makes it feel even more unsettling. After a while, Sulla steps down, voluntarily, which is unexpected, almost polite, like he's saying, "I've made my point, carry on." But the damage is done. The precedent is set. Armies can be used for internal power. Violence can shape politics. And the Republic is no longer quite what it used to be. Now, as we slowly drift through this period, there's a feeling that something is changing, not collapsing, not yet, but bending, becoming something else. Rome is still strong, still expanding, still in many ways unstoppable. But internally, it's starting to feel complicated. And those complications are going to lead very gently into the rise of individuals who don't just want to serve the Republic, but to control it. So, as everything settles for a moment and the night feels a little deeper, we'll let Rome sit in this strange in-between space. Still powerful, still dominant, but quietly and steadily, moving towards something much more personal. Because next, we meet a man who doesn't just play the game, he rewrites it. And, naturally, everyone else has to deal with the consequences. Alright, let's settle back in. Maybe take a slow breath, let everything soften a little. Because Rome, at this point, is no longer just dealing with outside enemies or even simple political disagreements. It's dealing with something more personal, more individual. And that brings us very gently to a man who looked at the Roman Republic with all its traditions and rules and thought, interesting. But what if I just didn't follow those? Enter Julius Caesar. Now, Caesar is not subtle. He's not quiet about his ambitions. He's not particularly interested in blending in. He's charming, intelligent, slightly dramatic, and very aware of his own importance, which, to be fair, he backs up quite effectively. But before he becomes that Caesar, the one everyone remembers, he's just another ambitious Roman politician trying to climb the ladder. And in Rome, that ladder is crowded, full of rivals, alliances, backroom deals. So naturally, Caesar forms a partnership, a very casual, totally stable, definitely not doomed alliance, with two other powerful men, Pompey and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Together, they form what's known as the First Triumvirate, which sounds official. It is not. It's more like three extremely powerful individuals agreeing not to get in each other's way for now. Because why not? Pompey brings military prestige. Crassus brings immense wealth. And Caesar brings ambition. A lot of it. For a while it works. Decisions get made. Power is shared. Rome continues functioning. But of course, this kind of arrangement is not built to last. Crassus eventually dies. Pompey drifts politically away from Caesar. And suddenly that balance is gone. Now it's just two powerful men with very different visions and a growing sense that there's only room for one of them at the top, which is not a relaxing situation. Meanwhile, Caesar is off in Gaul, which, geographically speaking, is roughly modern-day France and surrounding regions. And instead of just managing the province, he does what he tends to do. He conquers it extensively. Over several years, he campaigns across the region, expanding Roman territory, defeating various tribes, and, importantly, building a very loyal army. Because remember, by now, soldiers are loyal to their general. And Caesar is very good at being the kind of general soldiers follow. He shares hardships, rewards loyalty, writes about his victories in a way that makes him sound impressively competent, which he is. But also, he knows how to shape a narrative. So back in Rome, people are hearing about his successes, his victories, his growing power. And some of them are getting a little nervous, especially Pompey, because Caesar is not just winning battles. He's becoming very popular, very influential, and potentially very hard to control. So eventually the Senate, aligned more with Pompey at this point, makes a request. A simple one.
Calm.
Reasonable. Caesar, please disband your army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Which sounds fair. Except for Caesar, it's not. Because returning without his army means losing protection, losing influence, possibly facing prosecution from his political enemies. In other words, it's not really an invitation. It's a risk. So Caesar pauses, considers, and then makes a decision. A very quiet one. He approaches a small river. Nothing dramatic. No grand setting. Just a boundary line. The Rubicon. And there's a rule. Roman generals are not allowed to cross into Italy with their armies. It's one of those traditions meant to protect the Republic. So standing there, Caesar has a choice. Obey the rule, or ignore it. And of course, he ignores it. He crosses the river. And in doing so, he effectively declares war on the Republic. Not loudly, not with a speech, just by stepping forward. Because sometimes the biggest changes happen in very quiet moments. Now, what follows is not chaotic in our telling. No rushing, just a steady progression. Caesar advances.
Pompey retreats.
Not out of cowardice, but strategy. He moves east, gathering forces, preparing for a larger confrontation. And Caesar follows. Eventually they meet, and the outcome is decisive. Caesar wins. Pompey flees, and later, quietly, tragically, is killed in Egypt, which feels less like a dramatic ending and more like a fading away. One more rival gone, and Caesar now stands alone, at the top. Now, when he returns to Rome, he doesn't immediately declare himself king. That would be too obvious, too abrupt. Instead, he takes on titles, honors, positions. He becomes dictator. At first temporarily, then for longer periods, and eventually, dictator for life, which starts to sound less like a republic and more like something else. But Caesar is careful. He doesn't completely dismantle the system. He keeps the Senate, keeps the appearance of tradition, just adjusts things so that he's always at the center, which, to some people, feels efficient. To others, feels uncomfortable, because Rome has a long history of resisting kings. And even though Caesar isn't calling himself a king, it's starting to feel very similar. There are little signs, statues, honors, the way people speak about him. And quietly, a group of senators begins to worry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a growing sense that something needs to be done. Because if one man holds too much power, what happens to the republic? So they make a plan.
Calm.
Organized. Very Roman. And on a day that's meant to be just another political gathering, they act. Caesar is surrounded, not by enemies in armor, but by colleagues, fellow senators, people he knows. And in that quiet, enclosed space, they attack. It's not a battle. It's not chaotic. Just a sudden shift. And then, it's over. Julius Caesar is gone. And for a brief moment, there's a sense that maybe, just maybe, this restores balance. That removing one powerful individual will bring the Republic back to what it was. But Rome, by now, has changed. Too much.
Too deeply.
And instead of peace, what follows is more instability, more power struggles, more individuals stepping forward, ready to take that central position. Because once the rules have been bent, once the precedent has been set, it's very hard to return to how things were. So as we drift forward, slowly, calmly, we leave Rome in a familiar place. Powerful, dominant, still in many ways unstoppable, but now driven less by collective will and more by individuals, each one convinced they should be the one in control. And next, we meet someone who doesn't just take power, he reshapes the entire system so it looks stable again. Or, at least, stable enough. Alright, let's ease back into it. Maybe shift your head slightly, let your eyes rest a bit more. Because Rome, at this moment right after the quiet, very permanent exit of Julius Caesar, is not calm. Not even close. It's one of those situations where removing the main character doesn't end the story. It just leaves a very noticeable gap. And naturally, several people look at that gap and think, yes, that should probably be mine. So instead of stability, Rome gets another round of tension. Not loud, not chaotic in our telling, just a slow build-up. Because Caesar's allies and his enemies are now all trying to figure out what happens next. Let's drift toward one of the more interesting figures in this moment. A young man, not particularly intimidating at first glance. A bit reserved. A bit careful. Definitely not shouting for attention, which in Rome is almost suspicious. This is Octavian. Now, Octavian has something very useful. A connection. He is Caesar's adopted heir, which means he inherits not just a name, but a kind of legitimacy. A sense that maybe he has a right to step into that space. But at the same time, he's young, inexperienced, and surrounded by much older, much more established figures. So, at first, he doesn't dominate. He observes. He positions himself carefully. Because unlike some of his contemporaries, Octavian doesn't rush. He doesn't need to. Now, alongside him, there are two other major players. Mark Antony, a loyal supporter of Caesar, charismatic, confident, very comfortable in the spotlight. And Lepidus, less flashy, but still important enough to be included. Together, they form another alliance, the Second Triumvirate, which, again, sounds formal. And this time it actually is. It's legally recognized, which is already a sign that Rome is adapting to its new reality. 3 men sharing power officially. What could go wrong? Well, first, they decide to deal with Caesar's assassins, which is understandable. Not in a dramatic, revenge-driven way in our telling, just methodical. They track them down, face them in battle, and eventually defeat them. So that chapter closes quietly. But then, with that shared enemy gone, the alliance starts to feel less necessary and more temporary. Because when three people share power, it's rarely equal for long. Lepidus is the first to fade. Not dramatically removed, just gently pushed aside, reduced in influence, allowed to exist but not really compete, which leaves Octavian and Antony. Now, Antony, as we mentioned, is charismatic, confident, and at this point he's spending a lot of time in the eastern part of the Roman world, and more specifically, with Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra is not just a background figure. She's intelligent,
Strategic.
fully aware of the political landscape, and her alliance with Antony is both personal and political, which from Rome's perspective starts to look a little concerning, because Antony isn't just governing. He's aligning himself with a foreign queen, living partly outside Rome's direct influence. And Octavian, watching all of this from the west, sees an opportunity. He doesn't attack immediately. He doesn't rush into conflict. Instead, he builds a narrative. Carefully, patiently. He presents Antony not just as a rival, but as someone who's drifting away from Roman values, becoming less Roman,
More Eastern.
more influenced by Cleopatra, which, to the Roman audience, feels unsettling. And once that idea takes hold, it becomes easier to justify what comes next, which is another war. Of course it is. But this one feels slightly different, less like internal conflict, and more like Rome defending itself against an outside influence, even though it's still very much about power. Now let's drift toward the final confrontation, the Battle of Actium. It takes place at sea, which, by now, Rome is a bit more comfortable with, thanks to all that earlier practice and persistence. Octavian's forces, led by his general Marcus Agrippa, face Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, and the outcome is steady, not chaotic, just a gradual shift toward Octavian's favor. Antony and Cleopatra retreat. Their position weakens, and eventually they both die. Not in a dramatic, cinematic explosion of events, just a quiet end to a long, complicated story. And with that, Octavian stands alone. No rivals left. No alliances to maintain.
Just him.
Now, at this point, you might expect something obvious. A declaration. A title. A clear shift from republic to empire. But Octavian is more subtle than that. He understands something important. Romans don't like kings. They have a long memory of that. So instead of announcing himself as a ruler, he does something much more careful. He restores the republic. At least, that's how it's presented. Power is technically returned to the Senate. Old traditions are respected. Everything looks familiar. But underneath, the structure has changed, because Octavian, now known as Augustus, holds the key powers.
Control of the
Authority over major decisions. Influence that no one else can really challenge. It's like the Republic is still there, but gently, quietly orbiting around one person. And what's interesting is that it works. After decades of instability, of conflict, of tension, Rome finally feels calm, stable, predictable, which is something people eventually come to appreciate, even if it means accepting a different kind of system. So Augustus rules, not as a king, not officially, but as something new, something Rome hasn't quite named yet. And under him, the empire begins to settle into a rhythm. Expansion continues. Administration improves. The chaos of the late Republic fades into memory, and Rome becomes what we now recognize as the Roman Empire.
Strong.
Organized, and yes, still very much unstoppable, but in a quieter way now. Less about constant struggle, and more about maintaining control, holding everything together, which, as it turns out, is its own kind of challenge. So as we gently let this part of the story settle, we see Rome not at its most chaotic, but at its most balanced, at least on the surface, because underneath that stability, there are still tensions, still pressures, still human flaws quietly waiting. But for now, Rome rests, powerful, unified, and led by a man who didn't just win the game. He changed the rules so completely that everyone else simply adapted. And next, we'll drift into that calmer period, the empire at its height, where things seem almost peaceful, almost, because even the most stable systems have their little quirks, and Rome has quite a few. All right, let's settle in again. Maybe everything feels a bit softer now. The story, the pace, the mood. Because Rome, under Augustus, has finally reached something it's been accidentally working toward this whole time. Stability. Which, for Rome, is almost suspicious. After generations of chaos, political tension, and the occasional civil war, things are now organized.
Calm.
Predictable. At least mostly. Augustus rules carefully. He doesn't push too hard. Doesn't demand to be called king. Doesn't make people uncomfortable, at least not openly. He keeps the Senate around, lets them feel involved while quietly making sure the real decisions pass through him. It's a very smooth system, almost like a well-practiced performance. And for the average person living in the empire, life becomes manageable. Roads are built, trade flows, cities grow. There's a sense that things just work, which after everything we've drifted through feels like a nice place to pause. Of course, it doesn't last forever, because once Augustus is gone, the system he built still exists. But now it has to rely on whoever comes next. And that's where things begin to feel slightly less predictable. Let's gently move forward. After Augustus, we meet his successor, Tiberius. Now, Tiberius is not enthusiastic. He rules because he has to, not because he particularly wants to, which gives his reign a kind of distant quality. He's capable, efficient, but also withdrawn, suspicious. The kind of ruler who slowly pulls away from public life and eventually from Rome itself. He spends more time on the island of Capri, away from the center of power, which leaves the government functioning, but without a strong, visible presence. And when leadership feels distant, things tend to drift, not collapse, just loosen slightly. Still, the system holds. because Augustus built it well enough to survive a less engaged ruler, which is reassuring, at least for a while. Then we arrive at someone who feels very different, Caligula. Now, Caligula starts off fine, reasonable, popular even. People are hopeful, which in hindsight is almost charming, because over time things shift. Not all at once, just gradually. Caligula becomes more erratic, more unpredictable, more theatrical. There are stories, some exaggerated, some probably true, about his behavior. Unusual decisions, strange displays of power. At one point, there's even the suggestion that he considered making his horse a consul, which is not standard administrative practice. And you get the sense that the stability Rome worked so hard to build is being tested in a very different way. Not by war, not by external threats, but by personality. By the simple fact that when one person holds a lot of power, who that person is matters a great deal. Eventually, quietly, Caligula is removed. Again, not through a formal process. Just another reminder that Rome still has a habit of solving problems internally. And then we drift into a slightly calmer figure, Claudius. Now, Claudius is unexpected, not the obvious choice. A bit awkward, not particularly charismatic, often underestimated, which interestingly works in his favor, because while people don't expect much from him, he turns out to be quite capable. He focuses on administration, expands the empire, most notably into Britain, improves infrastructure, keeps things running. It's not flashy, not dramatic, just steady, which after Caligula feels like a relief. But of course this is Rome. So the calm doesn't stay perfectly intact, because next we arrive at someone who brings a different kind of energy. Nero. Now Nero is complicated. He starts young, guided by advisors. And at first things are fine. But over time, his interests shift, less toward governance, more toward performance, art, music, public appearances, which in itself isn't necessarily a problem. But when you're also responsible for running an empire, it can feel slightly misplaced. And then there's the Great Fire of Rome, a massive event. Destructive, disruptive. And while the exact details are debated, Nero's response becomes part of his reputation. There are stories, again some exaggerated, about him focusing more on his own image than on the crisis itself. And slowly his support erodes. Not dramatically, just a steady loss of confidence. Until eventually he too is gone. And Rome enters a brief period of uncertainty. A few emperors rise and fall quickly. Nothing stable. Just a reminder that even strong systems can wobble when leadership is inconsistent. But then, things settle again. Because Rome, as we've seen, has a habit of correcting itself. Gradually, persistently, and we move into a period often called the Five Good Emperors, which sounds reassuring, and mostly it is. These rulers, like Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, focus on stability, expansion, good governance. They're not perfect, but they're competent, thoughtful. In the case of Marcus Aurelius, even philosophical, writing quietly about life, duty, and the nature of existence, while also managing the vast complexity of an empire, which is a very Roman combination. And during this time, Rome reaches its height, territorially, economically. It feels complete, like everything has come together. All right, let's drift back in. Everything's a bit slower now.
Softer.
Maybe you're already half asleep, which, honestly, is perfect for this part. Because Rome at its peak is not dramatic. It's not loud. It's just very, very large. Under emperors like Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, the empire stretches across vast distances. From Britain down through North Africa, across the Middle East. It's impressive. Also, slightly impractical. Because managing something that big in a world without instant communication is complicated. Messages take weeks, sometimes months. Decisions are delayed, and local problems tend to stay local until they become much larger problems. But for a while, Rome handles it because Rome is good at systems. Governors are appointed. Roads connect distant regions. Armies are stationed where needed. Everything is organized. Mostly. Now, during this period, there's a sense of quiet confidence. The kind that comes from generations of success. Rome has faced enemies, internal conflict, unstable rulers, and it's always adjusted. Always found a way forward. So naturally, there's an assumption that it will keep doing that, which is comforting, but also a little risky, because not every problem can be solved the same way. Let's gently move forward to a slightly different kind of challenge. Not a war, not a rebellion, something less visible, a slow, creeping pressure. Economic strain. Now Rome's economy is complex. It relies on trade, agriculture, taxes from its vast provinces. And for a long time, expansion helps sustain it. New territories bring new resources, new wealth. But eventually expansion slows. There are fewer easy victories. Fewer new lands to absorb, and that steady influx of wealth begins to level out. Meanwhile, the costs of maintaining the empire don't go down. Armies still need to be paid. Infrastructure still needs maintenance. The system still needs to function. So there's a quiet imbalance. Nothing dramatic. Just expenses rising without the same level of new income. And to manage this, Rome does what many large systems do. It adjusts. Taxes increase. Currency is slightly altered. Not in an obvious way. Just a subtle reduction in value, which helps in the short term, but over time creates its own issues. Inflation, instability, a slow erosion of economic confidence. Again, nothing immediate, just a gradual shift. Now, while this is happening, there's also pressure on the borders. Rome's edges are long, very long, and not always easy to defend. To the north, various groups, often referred to collectively as barbarians, are moving, shifting, testing the boundaries. Not always invading. Sometimes just probing, looking for opportunities. And Rome responds the way it always has. With armies. With organization. With persistence. But here's the subtle difference. These pressures are constant. There's no clear end. No single war to win. just ongoing tension, which slowly, quietly wears things down. Now, let's float back for a moment to Marcus Aurelius, because during his reign we see this balance starting to feel a bit strained. He spends a lot of time on military campaigns, dealing with northern threats, managing conflicts, all while trying to maintain stability at home. And he does it well as anyone probably could. But even he can't fix everything. And when he's gone, something shifts again, because instead of another careful, thoughtful ruler, we get his son, Commodus. Now, Commodus is different. Where his father was philosophical, measured, Commodus is more interested in spectacle,
Personal glory.
comfort. He enjoys being seen, admired, even stepping into the arena as a gladiator, which, for an emperor, is unusual. It's like the focus moves away from governance and toward performance. And while that might be entertaining, it doesn't help with the quiet, underlying issues, the economic strain, the border pressures, the slow wear on the system. Those continue mostly unattended. And eventually, once again, the situation becomes unstable. Not all at once, just a gradual loosening. After Commodus, Rome enters a period that feels uncertain. Emperors rise and fall quickly. Power shifts, sometimes through politics, sometimes through force. It's not a single collapse, just a series of small disruptions, which over time add up. And here's the thing. Rome is still strong, still vast, still, in many ways, functioning. But that sense of being completely unstoppable is starting to soften, just slightly, because now, instead of always pushing forward, Rome is also holding things together, managing complexity, dealing with internal and external pressures at the same time. And that's a different kind of challenge, a quieter one, a slower one. So as we gently settle into this phase, we see an empire that hasn't fallen, hasn't even dramatically declined, but has shifted from expansion to maintenance, from confidence to careful balance. And as the night continues and everything grows a little more still, we'll drift into what happens when that balance becomes harder to maintain, when the pressures start to overlap, and Rome begins to feel something new. Not defeat, not yet, but fatigue, which, for something that once seemed unstoppable, is a very unfamiliar feeling. All right, let's settle in again. By now, everything probably feels slower. The story, the rhythm, maybe even your breathing, which fits perfectly, because Rome at this stage isn't collapsing in some dramatic, cinematic way. It's just tired. Not emotionally, of course. Empires don't sigh or stretch or ask for a break. But if they could, this would be the moment. After generations of expansion, constant management, and quiet internal strain, the system is still running, but it's working harder to do so. Let's drift gently into what historians often call the crisis of the 3rd century, which sounds intense. In reality, it's more like a long stretch of instability where things don't quite settle. Emperors come and go
Quickly.
sometimes lasting only a few years or less. And the way they come to power is often not through careful planning, more through opportunity, or military support, or simply being in the right place at the right time, which, as you can imagine, doesn't create the most stable leadership environment. At one point, there are multiple emperors claiming authority at the same time. Different regions, different loyalties. The empire, still technically one entity, but feeling a bit divided. Not officially, just in practice. Now, during all of this, the external pressures haven't stopped. In fact, they've become more consistent. To the east, a new, organized power emerges. Sasanian Empire. More structured, more assertive than previous rivals in that region. And they challenge Rome directly. Not constantly, but enough to keep attention focused and resources stretched. Meanwhile, along the northern borders, various groups continue to move, migrate, and occasionally push into Roman territory. Not always as full invasions, sometimes just testing, sometimes settling, but always present. And Rome responds, as it always has, with armies, with effort, with persistence. But now it feels different, because the responses are happening all the time, in multiple places, without much pause, which slowly wears things down. Now let's gently focus on one of the emperors who tries to bring things back together. Aurelian. Aurelian is practical, focused, not particularly interested in long philosophical debates. He looks at the empire, sees the fragmentation, the instability, and decides to fix it calmly, efficiently. He reconquers lost territories, reasserts control, strengthens defenses, even builds a massive wall around the city of Rome itself, which is both practical and a little symbolic, because for a long time, Rome didn't feel like it needed walls. Now it does, which tells you something. But Aurelian, despite his success, doesn't get a long, peaceful reign. Because again, this is Rome in a slightly unstable phase. And eventually he's gone too. Not dramatically. Just another transition. Another reset. And the pattern continues. Until we arrive at someone who approaches the problem a little differently. Diocletian. Now, Diocletian looks at the empire, and instead of trying to manage it as one unified system, he makes a decision, a very practical one. He divides it, not permanently, not as a final break, just administratively. He creates a system where multiple emperors rule different parts at the same time, sharing responsibility, reducing the burden on any single individual, which honestly makes sense. The empire is huge. One person managing everything was already becoming unrealistic. So Diocletian restructures things, strengthens the bureaucracy, adjusts the economy, attempts to stabilize the currency. And for a while, it works. Things feel more controlled, more manageable, not perfect, but improved. Of course, this also means the empire is no longer functioning as a single, tightly unified entity. It's more segmented, still connected, but less centralized, which is fine while strong leadership is in place. But like everything in Rome, it depends on the people involved. Now, as we slowly move toward the end of this phase, there's a sense that Rome hasn't fallen. Not even close. It's still vast, still powerful, still capable, but it's no longer effortlessly dominant, no longer expanding with that quiet confidence we saw earlier. Instead, it's managing, balancing,
adapting,
holding things together piece by piece.
and doing so takes energy, constantly.
So as the night gets even deeper and everything feels a little more still, we see Rome not as an unstoppable force charging forward, but as a vast system carefully maintained by people who are trying very steadily to keep it from slipping apart. And next, we'll drift into what happens when that system continues to evolve. When new ideas, new structures, and new identities begin to shape what Rome actually is. Because by this point, Rome isn't just changing in strength, it's changing in character. And that shift is quiet, but important. All right, let's ease back in. No rush. At this point, Rome isn't trying to conquer the world anymore. It already did that mostly. Now it's doing something far more complicated, trying to redefine itself without fully admitting that's what it's doing, which is very Roman. So we pick up where things feel a bit divided, a bit reorganized, thanks to the efforts of Diocletian. His system, multiple rulers, shared responsibility, has made the empire more manageable, less chaotic, less dependent on one person, but also a less unified in spirit. And when Diocletian eventually steps down voluntarily, which is still a slightly shocking move for a Roman emperor, it leaves behind a structure that works as long as everyone behaves, which historically is not something people consistently do. So naturally, after he leaves, there are disagreements, competing claims, a few quiet power struggles. Nothing Rome hasn't seen before. Just another round. And from that, slowly one figure rises. Let's drift toward him. Constantine the Great. Now, Constantine is interesting because he doesn't just fight for power. He reshapes what power means. But before we get there, he has to win, which he does through a series of conflicts. Again, not chaotic in our telling, just steady, calculated, until eventually he becomes the dominant ruler. And with that, he begins making changes. Not loud ones, not reckless ones, just meaningful. One of the most noticeable shifts is religious. Now, for a long time, Rome had a very flexible relationship with religion. Many gods, many traditions. As long as things stayed stable, it was fine. But Constantine moves things in a new direction. He embraces Christianity, not in a forceful, immediate way, just gradually. He legalizes it, supports it, allows it to grow within the empire, which is a significant shift, because Christianity had previously been somewhat on the margins, occasionally tolerated, occasionally persecuted. Now it's moving toward the center, and over time, this changes the cultural identity of Rome.
Quietly, slowly,
But permanently. Now, alongside that, Constantine makes another decision, a very practical one, very Roman in its own way. He looks at the empire, its size, its complexity, its geography, and decides that the old capital might not be the best place to manage everything from. So he establishes a new center of power. In the east, the city of Constantinople, strategically located, easier to defend, better positioned for trade and communication. And slowly, this new city becomes just as important as Rome itself, which is a subtle but massive shift, because now the heart of the empire is no longer singular. It's shared, split in identity, even if still technically unified. And over time, that split becomes more noticeable. The eastern part of the empire grows more stable, more economically resilient, more adaptable, while the western part begins to struggle a bit more, not dramatically, just gradually, a little less organized, a little more pressure from outside groups, a little less consistency in leadership. Now, as we drift further along, we start to see something that feels familiar, that quiet Roman pattern, adaptation. But this time it's happening unevenly. The East adapts well. The West tries but finds it harder. There are more incursions, more settlements by outside groups, not always violent, sometimes negotiated, sometimes invited, which sounds reasonable until those groups become permanent and harder to manage. And through all of this, Rome, especially in the West, is still trying to maintain the image of control, of continuity, of being the same unstoppable force it once was, even if underneath, things are shifting, because by now, Rome isn't just an empire. It's an idea, a system, a memory of strength that people are still trying to live up to. And that's a heavy thing to maintain. Now let's gently settle into that thought, because what we're seeing here isn't a sudden fall, not a dramatic ending, just a transformation. Rome becoming something else, something more divided, more complex, still powerful in parts, still functioning, but no longer moving as one unstoppable force. Instead, moving at different speeds, in different directions. And as the night gets quieter, we can feel that shift from unity to duality, from expansion to preservation, and eventually, that difference between East and West is going to matter more than anything else. But for now, we'll just let Rome exist in this in-between state. Still standing, still impressive, still carrying the weight of everything it used to be. And next, we'll drift into what happens when one half keeps going and the other slowly lets go. Alright, settle back in. We're still floating through Rome at night.
Still calm.
Still slow. Still pretending everything is just transitioning and not doing anything emotionally complicated like falling apart. Because officially, Rome is still Rome. Technically. But now we're in the phase where technically starts doing a lot of heavy lifting. Let's drift gently back into the divided world that emerged after Constantine's restructuring and the long administrative legacy of Diocletian. The empire is now split in practice between East and West. Not enemies, not officially separate, just two administrative personalities sharing the same historical apartment. And like most shared living arrangements in history, it starts off manageable and then slowly becomes a situation where nobody agrees on who bought the furniture. In the western half, Things are getting harder to maintain, not in a single dramatic moment, just a long accumulation of "we'll deal with that later." Borders are more active. Local power becomes more important than central coordination, and generals start becoming very important people, which is always a quiet warning sign in Roman history. Let's gently meet one of the more influential figures trying to keep things stable. Stilicho. He's a military leader in the West, trying to manage pressures from multiple directions while also dealing with the internal reality that the Western court is not exactly unified in its decision-making. You know that feeling when everyone technically has authority, but nobody agrees on anything?
Yeah, that.
Stilicho does his best. He negotiates. He fights when needed. He tries to hold the system together like someone calmly holding a slightly overfilled bag of water. And for a while, it works. Sort of. But Rome at this stage doesn't really reward sort of. Because the pressures keep coming. Outside groups are now not just testing borders. They're living within them, settling, integrating, becoming part of the system while also slowly changing it. And Rome, being Rome, tries to categorize all of this. But reality is less cooperative than paperwork. Now, let's float forward a bit, because leadership changes constantly. And eventually we arrive at an emperor who is still technically famous, but mostly for being young at the wrong time. Honorius. Honorius is emperor of the West during a period where the job description might as well read, "Good luck." He rules from a court that has been moved away from traditional Rome to places that are easier to defend and manage, which already tells you something is off. During his reign, major cities face pressure. Administration becomes fragmented, and central authority becomes more theoretical than practical. Honorius himself is often remembered not as a dramatic villain or heroic reformer, but as someone who presided over a system that was already shifting faster than anyone could comfortably manage. And while all this is happening, the West continues to rely heavily on military figures and local arrangements to keep things functioning, because that's what happens when centralized systems get tired.
They outsource themselves.
Now, let's gently arrive at one of the most symbolic moments in this long, slow transition. The final Western emperor, a teenager, which, historically, is not the ideal demographic for final authority of a centuries-old empire. Romulus Augustulus. Even his name feels like a historical joke that nobody in charge stopped to reconsider. Romulus, referencing Rome's mythical founder. Augustulus, basically Little Augustus.
So yes,
the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire is, in essence, Little Founding Emperor. Because why not add a bit of irony to the end of a millennium-scale political system? But Romulus Augustulus is not ruling in a strong, independent sense. Real power is elsewhere. In military leadership, in federated groups, in negotiated arrangements that are holding daily life together more than imperial decrees are. And then comes the moment historians like to mark, but which, in real life, probably felt more like a routine political transition than a cinematic ending. A military leader in Italy effectively deposes Romulus Augustulus. Not a grand apocalypse. Not fire and collapse. Just removal from office. and sending the imperial symbols away. This leader is Odoacer. He doesn't replace the empire with another empire right away. Instead, he governs Italy in his own way, acknowledging the Eastern Roman authority in Constantinople, but effectively ending the Western imperial line as it had existed. And just like that, the Western Roman Empire stops being a continuous political structure, not because everything collapsed at once, but because the system that held it together gradually stopped being able to coordinate itself as a single unit. Now pause here for a moment, because this is the part where history feels like it should get loud. But it doesn't. It just settles. The East continues. The West transforms. Local rulers, new kingdoms, new arrangements begin to form across former imperial territory. And the eastern half, centered around Constantinople, keeps going.